Hello everyone and welcome to this Research Connections webinar series. My name is Suresh Cuganesan and I am the Associate Dean, Student Success and Mobility at the University of Sydney Business School. As a common protocol for webinars, we have asked you to have your microphones muted and your cameras off, but we're certainly interested in your questions for this Research Connections webinar. So please post your questions to www.slido.com and use the event code #Connect3 as you will be receiving in the chat instructions. Now, before we continue further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on and welcome you to do the same based on where you are zooming in from. I'm currently on the lands of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their leaders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and pay my respects also to recognise their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. Now, today we are in for a really interesting and engaging Research Connections webinar. The Research Connections series are where we bring cutting edge, future focused research from experts within the business school and invite you to engage, reflect on the ideas, the provocative thinking, so that we can start to collectively shape a better world, a better society within which we operate. Our speakers today are fantastic. Today we have Professor Ray Cooper, who is the Professor of Gender, Work and Employment Relations at the University of Sydney Business School. She's also the co-director of the Women, Work and Leadership Research Group and the editor of the Journal of Industrial Relations. And just as a reflection of the impact that Ray has managed to achieve, she was recognised and was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2019, really sort of recognising her contributions to Australian workplace policy and practice. Our other speaker is Dr. Sarah Mosseri, who is a research associate in work and organisational studies at the University of Sydney Business School. Her research examines the production and maintenance of gender-based inequalities at work, and she applies a gendered lens to topics such as work-family conflict, workplace culture, and the future of work. Today's topic, the future of women and work in a post-COVID world, it brings together it really is at that intersection of two critical areas: women, work, gender, and COVID, and the disruptions, impacts, changes it is creating all around us. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ray. Ray, welcome.
Thanks, Suresh. I just had myself on mute, which is the phrase of 2020. Thanks for that lovely welcome. I'm on Gadigal land today, actually at work. So I'd also like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging and recognise that the land was never ceded. So myself and Sarah, hi Sarah, we haven't seen each other in person since March. We have been working on this project, which is looking at women and the future of work. And we did to use a phrase from 2020, we did quite a pivot in March to think about what COVID might mean for the future of work for women. We're working on this project with a number of other colleagues, including our business school colleague, Professor Marion Baird, who's also the co-director with me of the Women, Work and Leadership Research Group here in the University of Sydney Business School, but also a number of other great colleagues across the institution, including Professor Liz Hill, Professor Elspeth Probyn, Sarah and a range of other colleagues, and also our colleague, Professor Ariadne Vroman, who's recently, very sadly, left us to go to ANU, but we are still speaking to her. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to start out and talk a little bit about the future of work and women and the research that we've done very briefly. And then we're going to move to Sarah's going to talk us through what the impact of COVID has been on women's labour market experience, and it's been quite profound. And then I'll come back at the end. We really would like to have some engagement from the audience, so feel free to use that Slido code all the way through, and we'll get to your questions when we can. I can see a couple up there already that are really relevant to the things that we're talking about. Okay, so the first thing that I would say when looking at COVID is that we have to understand that where women are and the experience they've had during COVID really has related to where they were before COVID happened. And there are a range of differences and gaps that women have experienced over time in the Australian labour market and in most advanced economies, which relate to a range of gaps. This is despite the fact that women in Australia, and I'm not sure if our people attending know this, but women in Australia have the highest levels of educational attainment in our history. We have a higher level of educational attainment than do men, and we have the highest, we're ranked number 1 in the world for education of young girls, young women and women. So the fact that we have these gaps going on, I actually think this is a real problem, because it's not keeping up with that human capital accumulation of women and the investment they're making in themselves. And for us at universities, the great investments that women are making in themselves in higher education, that educational institutions are making, and also families of young women are making in their education. Also, there was, at the end of the year last year, was the highest level ever of women's labour force participation in Australia. So a number of gaps, including the underrepresentation across a number of areas. So you can see our little house metaphor that we always use in talking about the experience of women across the labour market. We often talk about the glass ceiling, and everyone knows what that is. So that's being able to see up to the highest levels of organisations, but actually women hitting their head on that ceiling. So there are less women in senior and strategic roles. That holds across sectors, and it's most acute in some particularly male-dominated sectors. So in some organisations, it's like a pyramid, with more women down the bottom and less women at the top. In some, it's more like a pin. It's not, but there's that shape. It's just a matter of degree in all across all sectors. There's also occupational and industry segregation, and they're what we call glass walls. And the glass walls really denote the fact that women and men work in really different occupations. And different professions and different sectors. And interestingly, in Australia, we have one of the most gender segregated labour markets in the world, in the OECD at least. And that is really connected to what happened to women in COVID, which is why I'm mentioning it. But there's another part to that metaphor, which is on the floor, which is the sticky floor. And that's that women are predominating in those low paid jobs. They tend to be casual jobs, so they don't have that security of employment. And that's a very feminised part of the labour force. So you've got the ceiling, you've got the walls, and you've got the floor. And I think all of those things help to explain what's happened in the labour market. But also we know pre-COVID, women absolutely did the lion's share of the unpaid work at home with caring for children, caring for other family members, and doing all of that social reproduction work that's associated with having us get out into the world, whether that's, working, organising homes, cleaning, cooking, those kind of things. So all of those things actually drive the gender pay gap. And the gender pay gap I've written there is the best case scenario, 14% gap between full-time working men and full-time working women. And I say best case scenario because if we use any other measures, the gap is bigger. So that doesn't include people who work part-time. It doesn't include bonuses, and it doesn't include a range of other loadings that people might have. So on the fact that we have the best educated female labour force in the world in history and better educated than men, having that 14 percentage point gap, I think, is a little bit scandalous. But that's pre-COVID. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so we've been looking at what women want in their future of work, and this data here is from our Australian Women's Working Futures project, and you can see the list of the team members at the bottom there. And what we did was a national survey of young men and young women, and we defined young as anyone younger than most of the members of the research team. That's been changed since Sarah turned up, so we defined young as under 40. And so 16 to 40-year-old working women and 16 to 40-year-old working men, the sample looks basically like the labour force. And we asked questions like this. So what matters a lot to you in your future of work? And you can see there the answers in red are women and the grey bars are men. And you can see we're representing here the top 5. What women are saying is that they want to be treated with respect at work. They want security of employment, good pay, interesting work, and flexibility. So you can see there's a difference in terms of the way that what men are saying and about the degree. So basically those top 5 are the top 5 for men and for women, but there's a difference. And remembering this is just, sorry, Sarah, can you just go back? This is, thanks. This is just the matters a lot. So that doesn't roll up matters a lot or matters somewhat. And you'll find that when we look at matters a lot and matters somewhat, those respect and security questions come up over 90% for women. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, then we asked women and men to think about what would they think would help them to succeed in their future of work. And you can see that's pretty nuanced answers that they're giving us here in our national survey. Skills and qualifications are identified absolutely as something that helps people to succeed, but there's also a range of issues that go to what employers might provide for these employees. So that's around access to flexibility, access to leaves to care, such as paid family leave, but it also relates to things that might happen outside of the workforce. And you can see there's 85% of women say that having a partner who shares equitably in the domestic work at home matters a lot to helping what women think will help them succeed in their future of work. And that's kind of something interesting and part of our research over time in this project. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, and this is pre-COVID. So this is what was worrying people about losing their jobs. We didn't actually have a variable in there for international pandemic. So I think that might rate in there more substantially. That would be the number 1 at the moment for men and for women. But you can notice one of the things we were looking at here is the extent to which women and men have different concerns about the impact of automation on job loss. And you can see there that women aren't very concerned about automation impacting on their jobs. So it's 29% of women compared to, I think it's about 40% of men will automation might impact on them. People are more worried about things, for example, such as poor company management or cheaper labour. Thanks, Sarah. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, and Sarah's going to talk us through some of the things that have been really, you would have picked up already in the public policy debate about what's happening to jobs during COVID, but also what the response has been from government in relation to these matters. So thanks, Sarah.
Great, thank you so much, Ray. So the research that Ray did just review was conducted, as she mentioned, prior to the COVID pandemic. And the data that I'm going to present now is going to cover much of the pandemic period, taking us from February of this year, which was a month or 2 before the pandemic really started to affect the Australian labour market, through to as close as we can get to the present day, which in some cases is August and others is September. The data that I'm drawing on is primarily from the Australian Bureau of Statistics releases. And actually, I should note that a new release is due out tomorrow. So we may see these patterns evolve further with that new batch of data. Now, looking here at the data, COVID's effect on the labor market has been substantial, to say the least. September employment numbers, so that's last month's employment numbers, were down by about 500,000 compared to where they were back in February, which was prior to social distancing measures being put into effect. As another measure of just how bad things are, the unemployment rate is up to about 6.9% right now, compared to 5.2% at this point last year. Now, there have been actually some improvements. In a lot of ways, April and May were some of the toughest months so far. In fact, if we look at May, employment was down by about 800,000 compared to February then. So now we're at a loss of 500,000. So we are seeing some recovery since the nadir of the crisis. But the point I want to get to now is that these high-level indicators like employment numbers and the unemployment rate really don't tell us the whole story. There's a lot going on beneath the surface. So what I'm going to do now is take you through a few additional charts to kind of parse out some of that detail and that nuance. Unemployment numbers tell us about the people who have lost their jobs, but they don't tell us about the people who have jobs, but they can't get enough of the paid hours that they need. So those people might include full-time workers, who have been involuntarily pushed into part-time work, or they might include part-time workers who are not able to get enough of the regular hours that they need each week. So to capture these people, we look at underemployment. In this chart here, I've mapped the underemployment rate in green, and that's what you see starting at 8.6% going to 11.4%. And you might take notice of a few things here. First, you can see that underemployment affects a greater swath of the labor market than unemployment, which is unemployment is that dotted line at the bottom. So you can see that's quite a bit lower. Second, you can see that underemployment spiked earlier than unemployment because it really spiked in April and May, while unemployment kind of spiked in June and July. And that's because hour cuts are a widely used tools by employers that helps them to stay flexible and to quickly adjust to a changing labor market, often at the expense of workers. And I'm sure Ray and I can both talk a bit more about kind of that employer-driven flexibility during the Q&A if you'd like. The last thing you might notice on this chart is that while unemployment rates have started to even out between women and men, you can see here that women's underemployment rate, so that's that top line in red, started off higher than men's, which is in blue, and it has remained higher than men's throughout the crisis. The second area of nuance I'd like to take you through is the variation in labor market effects across industries. So in this chart, I've mapped just one indicator of that variation, and that's the percent change in employment between February and August. You can see that the two hardest hit industries have been accommodation and food services, and also arts and recreation. And those are notably two industries where women make up about 50% or more of the working population. Interestingly, if you look here in the middle, you can see that health and social services, which is a feminized field that's been absolutely critical to the COVID response, has also seen, to my mind, surprising employment losses during this time. And then a bit further down, you can see that industries like mining, public administration, and forestry and agriculture have been less negatively affected, at least in terms of employment losses. If I were to have charted instead percent change in work hours, you'd see some differences, but in terms of the extremities of this spectrum, so accommodation and food services doing really badly, and utilities and energy doing quite well, those remain about the same. So just to summarize, COVID has had kind of these detrimental effects across the labor market, and those effects have been widespread, but they haven't necessarily been felt evenly across different populations. So what I'd like to do now is focus our discussion on one particular group that Ray and I have a lot of expertise in, and that is women. So specifically, I'm going to outline 3 ways that COVID has influenced women's labor market experiences. First, as you can see here, women have been essential to the COVID response. They dominate the industries that have been on the front line. They make up 78% of health and social assistance workers, 71% of educators, and 60% of retail workers. They've been definitely the heroes of the crisis, caring for some of our most vulnerable populations. And I've bullet pointed that out further here, and also risking their lives to keep Australia going during this really difficult period. Unfortunately, the critical work that women do is often erroneously categorized as low-skilled, and it's substantially undervalued. In fact, in 2019, gender segregation across industries and occupations, so those kind of glass walls that Ray was talking about, that accounted for almost 1/5 of the gender pay gap. And that's because jobs within feminized industries and occupations are paid less on average than jobs traditionally held by men. And the problematic nature of this is really made salient in the current moment because it's been exactly these undervalued jobs that we've been relying on most during the pandemic. In addition to kind of being in these feminized fields that have been both critical and undervalued, women have also been doing more unpaid work at home during the crisis than men, making it really difficult for them to maintain stable connections to the labor market. As Ray said, prior to COVID, women were doing about double the unpaid work at home compared to men in households with children. And that's something that scholars have often referred to as the second shift. During COVID, both women and men in dual earner households have been doing more of this unpaid domestic work, but women have been doing so at a higher rate. And this is data coming out of the University of Melbourne. So in a survey that they did during COVID, women that they surveyed reported that they were doing about an extra hour of housework and almost 4 extra hours of care each day. while men were spending approximately 45 extra minutes a day on housework and almost 3 extra hours on care. So as you can imagine, that adds up pretty quickly. Over the course of a week, women are doing about 34 extra hours of unpaid work, and men are doing about 25 and a half hours during the pandemic. That's a lot for everybody. But because men were already doing about double the work before, and now their excess during COVID is about 9 hours a week more than men's, the gender gap in unpaid labor at home is increasing during the pandemic. So the point is that as we think about recovery efforts, with family incomes decreasing due to job and hour losses, it makes it harder to pay for childcare, and women are really stepping in to make up that difference. So affordable childcare is really essential to get women back in the paid labor market. Also, just as an aside, because childcare is a feminized field, support to that industry would also help women as paid care workers. So child care supports are really beneficial to women across the labor market. Then the final topic that I want to hit is that women actually experience the negative labor market effects of the crisis more acutely than men. And that's particularly true in the early stages of the crisis. And that gender difference is really distinct compared to other economic crises, where men's employment has typically suffered more than women's employment has. So I want to draw your attention to this chart here on the left. You can see here that I've mapped the percentage decrease in employment in solid lines and the percentage decrease in hours in dashed lines, with women in red and men in blue. And across all these points, that decrease is compared to where things were in February. So if you look at the dotted lines, you see huge drops in work hours in April, with women's hours dropping by over 20% compared to less than a 15% drop for men. Similarly, women's employment losses, the solid lines, have been greater than men's during most of the crisis. More recently, in August, we see some change in this. Women's and men's employment and hours are both improving and converging. And while this improvement is certainly good news, especially for women, it doesn't mean that women are in the clear. So it's important to remember that women went into, as Ray was kind of mentioning at the beginning, they went into the pandemic with less pay. They also went in with less retirement funds and carrying a heavier burden in terms of unpaid domestic labor as compared to men. So while women's losses in job security and pay during this period were a particularly hard-felt blow, and the pandemic is likely to leave kind of long-term scars in terms of their continued labor market participation, their upward mobility, and their savings. And this is especially something we want to keep an eye out on because, as I said, in previous crises, women generally fared better during the crisis. But actually in those crises, the long-term labor market effects for women after the crisis were worse than they were for men. So given that women didn't actually fare well at all during this crisis this time, there's really a concern about the long-term gendered consequences. And then just lastly, I would say that women are pretty aware of this. They're feeling this pretty heartily. A new study released last week out of the University of Melbourne found that women are reporting really high levels of anxiety, higher than men, about keeping their jobs, about funding their retirements, and about managing work and family. And as a result, the study finds that they're suffering from poor sleep and poor mental health. So as you can see, women need relief and they need support. And given the data I've presented, a gender-focused recovery is really essential in the coming months, in the coming years, to ensure that we have this equitable future of work and a healthy national economy. So on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Ray, because I know she has a few things she wanted to say related to the recovery in particular.
Thanks, Sarah. So this graph, this figure here, is not one that we've put together, but the Grattan Institute put this one together. So where Sarah has, I think, put together quite a comprehensive picture of the gendered impact of COVID, I think we can see there's also a very gendered impact in terms of the response from government, in terms of stimulus and in terms of other responses in different sectors, if we have a look at this through a gendered lens. I saw this graph on Twitter, as those of you who know me well know that I'm a bit mad for Twitter, and we couldn't help but put this one in. So this is really looking at what the Grattan Institute referred to as being hard hit or hard hat. And what you can see is the darker the line, so the scale is, the more red the dots are, the more feminised the sector is, and the more towards yellow, the more male-dominated the sector is. And the higher up in terms of the scale, so if they appear higher on the figure, the more government funding has been put into those sectors. What stands out absolutely for me is looking first down at those areas where job loss has been most significant, and I think Sarah's really comprehensively shown this through ABS data, which is where this is coming from as well, where we've had a massive hit in arts and recreation, hospitality, administration, all areas that are quite feminised. And then you have a look at where the greatest amount of government money has been directed in response. And I'll just draw your attention to the great big yellow dot at the top in construction, which is both the highest level of stimulus that's been put in by government, but also, if you remember, in terms of Sarah's presentation, but also where this sits here on this axis, is not one of the areas that has been massively impacted as a result of jobs loss and hours loss through the period since March. So I think that's quite comprehensively says that women have been profoundly affected. Are women being profoundly represented in the way that government is responding? I think this figure just says to us, I think I'll just put it at no. Okay, thanks, Sarah. Go to the next one. Can see some great questions coming in too, so don't forget, go into Slido and Connect 3 if you want to ask us questions, because we're really keen to hear what you think. Okay, so what does all of this mean for us in thinking about how we approach the future of work and what we think about women's future of work post-COVID? First thing I'd say is that a number of things that our research suggests that women really want from their future of work that are very important to them. One of which, right at the top, apart from respect, was job security. All of the evidence suggests that the thing that women are most worried about before COVID even hit was security, and that's the thing that has really been hit. The COVID crisis and the recession that's following and that we're in right now is a disaster for many, many workers, millions of people out of work. It's a particular problem for security of employment for women. So I think we have to keep an eye on that and to try to understand both unemployment, underemployment and underutilisation and what that might mean in a gendered sense. I'm often find myself being a little bit, how shall we say, depressing when I'm talking about what the gender dynamics are in the labour force. I think I've got to try to pull out one key thing that might be a positive that we could take away from the COVID period, and that's in relation to flexibility. Now, I know that nobody really wanted to do the flexibility and the work from home, remote working in the way that we did in the COVID period. But all of our research, and Marion Baird and I have done quite a bit of research on this over time, suggests that managers in Australia and organisations have a tendency to be a little reticent about letting their workers work at home. We would argue that this is largely about control and often about the fact that line managers in Australia just don't quite get the concept that someone might not be visible to them in the office next door and still be productive. So I think one positive that might come out of this, and this will be good for women and for men, is that we've had this national experiment where I think we've shown that flexibility and work from home can actually work. So why not actually continue that and take some of the lessons we've learned there? And that might be one of the ways that we can try to snap forward, which is something that Sarah and I have been trying to talk about, rather than snapping back, which some others have referred to where we were, because we don't think that's a great place to go in terms of women's working lives. So let's take on board some good flexibility lessons and let's try to incorporate that into the way our organisations run. Okay, in terms of pay, we know that women have lost more jobs, more hours. They already had half the retirement income that men did when they retire before COVID. We know that women have been the majority of people accessing and running down their super through the emergency super policy. What is this going to mean over time? Well, we know that the majority of people taking money out because they've been the hardest hit are young people and young women. And thinking through some of the research that we know about what the compounding effects of taking super out or not having a super balance to start with in the early years, taking $10,000 out, which is entirely legal and entirely encouraged in the current framework for women who are under 30, could end up being, hundreds of thousands of dollars in later life. That's a worry for those women. That's a worry for their families. That's a big worry for the economy, in my view. Okay, so thinking about feminised work, which is something that Sarah and I have been looking at quite a lot. is this an opportunity as well? So we've seen the front line being highly feminised as a part of this crisis. Does this mean we're going to start to better value women's work and highly feminised work? Whether that's paid work in terms of early childhood education, aged care, community care, retail even, or does it mean that we're going to snap back to where we were before? There's also been a strong uptick in unpaid work, but let's see whether men being at home and engaging in that work will mean that they're going to, not in as great numbers as women, but maybe that means that men are going to contribute more at home. That would be, in my view, a good thing. And what about education? And that's somewhere where we all are. And I can see there's a question on Slido about this as well. What will the role of education be in building back better? How can we support improved training and education for women and more broadly across the economy? I would think that higher education and vocational education are critical parts to recovery for the nation. I think it's kind of another policy issue that's been really missed and not been very impressive is actually the extent to which universities have not been part of the recovery strategy that governments have put in place. Okay, and I guess I can see Suresh has turned back up, which probably means Ray needs to be quiet, but I just wanted to point out that if you wanted to have a look at some of our materials from the Australian Women's Working Futures Project, there's a link there, and feel free to follow that and get in touch with us if you have any questions. So with that, I'll end, and Suresh, let's have some questions, I think.
Great. I think there are a lot of questions, so it's a great opportunity to have dialogue. And Ray, I think you've covered some of this, which there's a number of questions that really coalesce around the government's response, especially as enshrined with the budget. You've clearly answered some questions around what is their response. I guess the question is, why do governments always support your sort of traditional areas like construction over areas like childcare? What could they have done differently? Just unmute there, right?
That's the title of all papers that should be written in 2020. You're on mute. Good question. I hope that was one of my students. I can see lots of my students from my current class asking these sorts of questions. Look, what is the answer to that question? I think reaching to invest in men's jobs, in hard infrastructure, in roads, ports, rail, is a fairly standard response to try to prop up the economy. I'm not opposed to spending money on construction or infrastructure. In fact, I think that's quite important as we try to pump the economy. So I'm not opposed to that, but I do think that sometimes governments take a lazy approach and they don't try to understand in a gendered way what the impact will be. So I guess the question is it a malicious, ignoring of women's jobs and potentially women's economic independence, or is it just what we've always done and we've always valued men's employment and over women's, and we don't, maybe there is a deep reticence there somewhere in some parts of some governments to actually recognise that women's jobs are legitimate jobs and women actually get a lot of both economic independence and also enjoyment out of their work in the same way that their family members do. So I think it's partly about reaching back to what we've always done, but I think it's also that they're not taking a gendered lens. We saw this in the budget, and there's been a lot of conversation about that in the last week or two, where there just hasn't been there was an agreement that there would be budget statements that went to what the gendered impact of budget would be. I think government was actually shocked that people said, well, hang on, the workers who have been most affected here have been women. Where's the spend in the budget? In the billions of dollars of budget, where's the spend for women? I think the government was actually shocked by that. So I don't know. I think it's a framing, and I think it's also a conservatism about what's always been done.
Okay, and maybe a specific response to this is, how can we support women in creative industries in addition to women in the corporate world?
Good question. Sarah, did you want to answer that one? No? Okay. Women in creative industries, look, let's support the creative industries full stop. I don't think there's a lot of spend in those areas. So important economically, socially, and also for our well-being in those areas, and also massive employers. Haven't spent a lot of spend at all. So let's.
And does it speak to more maybe transient nature of the work in that industry? I'm just sort of thinking through.
Well, they were hard. I mean, if you think about think through areas like theatres and production and even movie production, which are actually quite large employers, they shut immediately. They have just gone overnight. Transients, but also the sort of physical nature of the work, I think is really obvious. Also, I don't know whether they're transient, but they're certainly areas that rely very much on contract labour or, precarious contracts. And so I think that means that things could go very quickly. But also a lot of those workers in the creative industries didn't access some of the government support around JobKeeper, for example, because they had to qualify by having been employed even as a casual for a particular period of time, which we know really hit those creative industries really hard. So what was the second part of the question, Suresh? I've forgotten.
No, I think you've covered it in relation to the creative industries. There's another specific sort of question in relation to a particular segment, and that relates to women that are 45 years plus. They're also negatively impacted. And this group also has the issues around being sort of perceived to be overqualified.
Yeah, absolutely. If the question is about budget and response to COVID, no, there's not been much for that group, and they're actually quite a profoundly affected.
And how can they overcome it?
The question is, so women are overcoming women in the Australian labour market are doing all of the things they've been told to do. Go to university, invest in yourself, qualify yourself. They're very aware of the need to upskill, reskill, get new skills, get a breadth of skills. They're doing what they've always been told to do. I just don't think broadly that government or many organisations, employing organisations, actually are responding in the way that they should. I think you're right, particularly the budget. Okay, at one level you could say there was support in budget for the under 30s and women, of course, under 30 as well as men. So there's some budget there for very young women, but there was no specific budget spend or allocation for older women. I'm horrified to say that over 45 is older, but sadly it is, even though I'm in that group. There needs to be a concentration on that, on gender and a gendered lens, but also to understand the different experiences of different groups of women in the labour market.
Great. There's a bunch of questions that come together around the if you like, the sphere of the home, and what occurs. And I must say, I did find some of that, the numbers confronting, because I was thinking I was perhaps doing a bit more, but obviously not enough, given the broad impact that COVID has had. So a number of questions, but I guess the most powerful of these questions, the most explicit, is this: why is there no calling out of men's exploitation of women's domestic labour? Why normalize this?
Okay, I'm going to hand that one to Sarah because that's more her area than mine.
Yeah.
I think it's a great. I think we should challenge at a micro level and a macro level that men kind of do more. I took a look through some of the other questions, and I think it's kind of connected. So first, I think it's just kind of raising awareness, and as one of the questions mentioned, men kind of over-report their hours. I think this whole experience of kind of people working from home, having more of this unpaid work happening, has been a bit of an eye-opener. Unfortunately, what is likely the case is that men are over-reporting. We know that they were over-reporting beforehand, so they're probably over-reporting now. The extent is, I wonder if the kind of empirical question to look at is, are they over-reporting more during the crisis because it feels so much like more confronting to them? And that's a really important question to kind of think about. At the same time, though, I do think these gaps that we're showing are probably at least a sort of measure of the differences that are happening. So even if men are over-reporting their hours, what we're capturing here is still really significant and probably the best case scenario. Also, going back to kind of calling men out, I think we should, like I said, challenge men. I think I'm a sociologist, so I always tend to come back to like the systemic issues. I think we also have to confront kind of the normative masculinity, dominant forms of masculinity, and what masculinity, what our culture kind of values in masculinity and promotes, and really challenge that as a society. And also wrapped up in that, some notions of heteronormativity as well, and kind of really kind of challenge those different cultural beliefs that we have. And that's challenging them at home by calling out maybe men in your life. It's challenging them in the workplace by creating parental leave that is by both women and men. There's a lot of ways that we can kind of do this that are kind of push and pull factors.
Fantastic.
Suresh, can I add one thing? Maybe men can call themselves out. So it's what should women do about all of these issues, as though it's assuming it's a women's issue to start with. Like maybe men just need to step up a little bit more, I think, as dads and as partners at home and also at work to support women.
Great. I think you've covered a number of the questions off as well, Sarah, which is fantastic. And we are trying to get to all the questions. I guess, Sarah, in particular, I might ask you this question, in terms of then, young profession groups and so on, and the ongoing challenge of sexual harassment, what more could be done in this space?
It's still such a huge problem. Just in our research alone, we saw that, I think it was, Ray, correct me if I'm wrong, but 12% of women reported that they had ever experienced sexual harassment. When you
No, Sarah, it's 12% currently experiencing sexual harassment. Yeah, at the moment.
And when you look at, when you go into more male-dominated fields, that number almost doubles. And so I think it's absolutely a problem. I think it's one that continues to need attention. So I know the recent Australian Human Rights Commission has just looked into this. We just need more on this, and we need more targeted results. We need to hold people accountable. So we've started to see that a bit with the Me Too movement, but it's just a start. And I know everybody was kind of worried about that kind of blowing over, and I think we have to continue to be worried about that. It's something that is definitely not going away anytime soon, and is not just, sexual harassment is the apex of it. Right? It's also, I know Ray has done a lot of research on gender harassment and gender-based harassment, bullying, kind of gaslighting at work. So it's not just the sexual harassment, it's kind of all of it. It's this whole culture of excluding women and at work.
Agree.
I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Particularly a big problem in very male-dominated fields. And we've done a project looking at that, where gender harassment, which is really, wouldn't meet the definitions of sexual harassment under the legislation, but really, as Sarah says, is an hourly, daily experience in some of those sectors of speaking over, questioning technical competence and capability. And our research really shows that this is undermining some of the moves by government, business and women's organisations to try to get women to move into some of those really lucrative male-dominated areas, including in STEM areas. So it's a challenge that's a challenge for women, definitely, but I think it's also a challenge more broadly in terms of business and economy. So I think it's something that should be worrying all of us, particularly people in our school, business school, thinking about what the future of business is. This kind of level, looking and gender-based respect is critical for us to actually build sustainable organisations.
And that's a great way to start to bring this to a close. Such an important topic, and we always run out of time. I might just ask though, Ray and Sarah, are there any sort of last comments you'd like to make in terms of, as a group, as a community, as a collective, what we should be sort of thinking, doing, walking away from this great discussion?
Sarah? Do you want to go first?
Sure. Just thinking about this group and the fact that we're in a university setting, I would just say in any analysis, just bring that gender lens. I think we've seen what happens when that's missing at a national level. And just a reminder that a gender lens, gender isn't just at the level of individual identities. It, as we've talked about, kind of permeates through our culture, it permeates through the labor market. So thinking about gender more than just, oh, what are women doing and what are men doing, but really thinking about these kind of broader ways in which our whole labor market is gendered, and kind of always keeping that front of mind is essential.
I couldn't agree more, and I probably couldn't say it better. I'll agree with Sarah and also say business needs to listen to women, governments need to listen to women, and women need to be able to feel that they can speak at work and at home to represent their interests. And we're just hoping that our work is contributing in some way to some sort of insight into that.
And I think the other thing you mentioned very explicitly is men need to see this as an issue that directly connects to them.
Thank you, Suresh. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. Great discussion. We always run out of time, as I said, for such important conversations about how we might contribute to a better, fairer, more just society. So all of you, I'm sure it's a webinar, but we'll be thanking you, Ray and Sarah, for the insights that you've shared. And thank you, attendees, for participating in this. It's through your questions that we were able to start to connect, and showcase some of the great research in the business school. Our next Research Connections webinar is Wednesday, November 4th, 2020 at 3 p.m. Guest speaker is Chris Wright, our very own Chris Wright, on the topic Environmental Responsibility and Climate Change in a Recovery. Another great thought-provoking topic, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you all. Thank you, Ray, again. Thank you, Sarah, for bringing this important topic to our attention.
Thanks, Suresh.
Bye.